Bonjour, je m'appelle David Malone.
Good afternoon. My name is David Malone, and I work at IDRC. Now, if you would like to follow the conference as well as the discussion following in French, we have simultaneous interpretation. Please don't hesitate to get the earphones.
And I have the privilege of working here. We're delighted today to have with us Michael Young, who is a singular figure in Lebanon, but much more widely in the Arab world, because he edits the best opinion page in English of the Arab world by far, and one that has influence way beyond the circulation of the Daily Star itself in Beirut, which is the newspaper he has worked for many years now. Many of the articles are syndicated throughout the region, and the point of view of the page has attracted, it seems to me, an ever-growing number of devotees as time has gone on, Michael. So rather than alienating people through the strong views you publish, you just publish more strong views of varying viewpoints. And I think it's been a very kinetic, very unusual success in the newspaper world at a time when many newspapers seem to be cutting back on opinion. And getting into the corollary, which seems to be infotainment, which you've avoided assiduously. Michael agreed to come to Ottawa when we met in Beirut earlier this year. It's difficult for him to get away. He wrote a couple of years ago an absolutely wonderful book. As all of you know who come regularly, I don't spend a lot of time promoting books here, but this one I will promote because I enjoyed rereading it so much the other day. It's called The Ghosts of Martyrs Square, as you'll know from the notices of the event. In a way, its focal point is the assassination of Rafic Hariri and events that followed immediately, and it stays up to date until probably early 2009. But it's very relevant to what's going on today in the Arab world, I think. So rereading it, I read it with a very different lens just now and found it very stimulating in relation to current events in the Arab world, and also in Lebanon itself, which tends to be out of focus for any of us who aren't of Lebanese extraction or narrowly focused on Lebanon. Michael was born in the United States. His father was an American. His mother was a Lebanese. And when he was young, alas, his father died as a very young man. And his mother took him back to Lebanon. He grew up in Lebanon. He is a Lebanese. And with the strong convictions that come with being Lebanese. He was educated at that great institution, the American University of Beirut, which we've also often mentioned here and with which IDRC has a number of links. He also studied at Johns Hopkins University in the state at graduate level. So without taking up any more airtime, Michael, over to you. And what we're going to do, because Michael's suffering from an eye affliction, is after he's finished speaking, we're going to take a 3-minute break so that he can tend to his eyes, and then he'll come back for the exchange with all of you. So, Michael, over to you.
Thank you. I don't promise to come back after the. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you, David, for that very generous introduction. I thought, the topic today is, as you know, the Lebanon 2005 first spark of the Arab Spring. I did put a question mark there, and I think I even responded to that question mark in the little blurb I was asked to provide by saying Well, no, it probably wasn't the first spark of the Arab Spring, and yet it was in many of the things that we saw in Lebanon in 2005 are essential ingredients in what we are seeing today in other Arab countries. And this, in a sense, I think is quite important, because as we look today, as we seek to impose some kind of interpretation on what's happening in the Arab world today, we tend to see 2011 as sort of a unique moment. Before we had the Dark Ages, no one knows what we'll have afterwards. I think it's worth correcting that image just a little bit. I'm speaking about Lebanon, but two things happened in 2005 I think we should mention. There were the Iraqi elections in January. I think they merit also a role in this story, but I'm not Iraqi, so I'm going to tell you about the second thing that happened. It's Lebanon. And I think we should bear in mind what happened there and see, in a way, how does it reflect what we're seeing today. I think I was right to be surprised when the myriad Arab revolts began earlier this year, and I noticed that absolutely no one, almost nobody, in terms of the Arab intelligentsia, Arab media, almost no one seemed to mention Lebanon 2005 or Iraq 2005, but let's stick to Lebanon. No one mentioned it, or very few. Now, the reason for my surprise was that, as I said, everything that took place in Lebanon, or many of the salient aspects that took place in Lebanon, are being repeated today. Now, for those of you who maybe need your memory refreshed, what happened in Lebanon in 2005, very briefly? Rafic Hariri, not Saad,
yes, I'm sorry,
but Saad will forgive you for that. Rafic Hariri, Saad's father, was assassinated on the 14th of February, 2005. For about a month after that, you had a number, tens of thousands, indeed hundreds of thousands of people at some stages going down to Martyrs Square in Beirut and demanding a withdrawal of Syrian forces from Lebanon, because Syria was seen, to my mind rightly, as a key actor in the assassination of Hariri, demanding the resignation of the Lebanese government, at the time the Karami government, and demanding the resignation of security chiefs, in particular, the head of the internal security forces, the head of what's known as the Sûreté Générale, the Minister of Justice, and the head of the ISF. And in April of 2005, the Syrians, I'm really cutting to the chase here, the Syrians did pull their forces out of Lebanon after, I believe, a 29-year presence in the country. This entire episode was called, I think, mistakenly, the Cedar Revolution. At the time, if you recall, this was named by Paula Dobriansky. At the time, the Americans were very much taken up by revolutions, much more than they seem to be today. And in fact, Lebanon had earned this label, although what happened in 2005 was in no way a revolution. It was simply a fine emancipatory moment, a fine moment of emancipation. Now, those who went down to Martyrs Square represented a substantial cross-section of society, with, I think, an important exception. A majority in the Shia community did not go down there. They supported Hezbollah, they still do. And yet, very clearly in 2005, the majority that did go down to Martyrs Square was, it was a majority of the Lebanese population. And I believe that these demands that they had put forward were very much demands that reflected a majority view of the mood at the time. Now, I'd like to investigate, I'm not going to spend my time going back to 2005, I'd like to investigate that moment in the context of what we're seeing today in the Arab world. And with your permission, I will limit this to four important, as I said, four salient issues that happened then and that we see reflected today. What are these four salient issues that I will focus on? The first is the use of public space. Martyrs Square in Lebanon, many other squares we've seen in the last year. The second issue I would like to focus on is the demand for an overhauling of the security structure, for the instruments of repression. This we saw in Lebanon in 2005. We've seen it this year again in virtually all the Arab countries. A third thing to investigate is the role of foreign intervention. And the last thing is the aftermath, and how the aftermath of Lebanon 2005 and of what we're seeing today in many other Arab countries, how it may lead to a reinterpretation of these singular events. Let me begin with the use of space. As we survey what happened in Egypt, Libya, Bahrain, Yemen, Syria, we noticed something that was very clear in Lebanon in 2005. And it's something that the Lebanese grasped, I think, early on. They grasped the need, when engaging in protest, to define yourself, to secure for yourself a public space where rallies can be held, toward which protesters can converge, which is under the eye of media, and that retains symbolic as much as geographic relevance. That said, the protesters in many Arab societies today have almost endowed on those places where they meet a symbolism of its own. It's very important, I think, to retain the power, the symbolic power of a place. And I think this is what happened in Lebanon in 2005. It's what we see in Tahrir Square. Now, what happened in Martyrs Square, just if I could just, again, take you back briefly. Martyrs Square, I don't know how many of you have been to Beirut, but it's located really in the downtown area, the rebuilt downtown area of Beirut. It's on the old Green Line between the predominantly Muslim western part of the capital and the predominantly Christian eastern part of the capital. Therefore, it's almost naturally, it could be transformed into a place of reconciliation. It was also the place, and this was maybe a coincidence, but it was but a very happy coincidence. It was the place where the Hariri family decided to bury Rafic Hariri when he was assassinated. And this sort of bestowed on the place a symbolic value, but it did something else, I think, in practical terms that was very interesting. It's that it almost prevented the security forces from clearing Martyrs Square easily, because people would go down to the square to visit Hariri's tomb, and then they would gravitate towards Martyrs Square, which is only a few dozen meters away. And, the security forces could not very well prevent people from going and visiting the tomb of the recently assassinated Rafic Hariri. So these two spaces, Hariri's tomb and Martyrs Square, in a sense, fed off each other and gave they in a way kept each other alive. Also, two other factors. Martyrs Square is next to the old city that Hariri was responsible for rebuilding. It was a controversial reconstruction project, but he was essential in bringing it to fruition. So that added to the symbolism. And it was also near a number of media outlets, including the Al-Nahar newspaper, so that it was a place easy to watch, a place easy to keep under the eye of the camera. Now, in many respects, we see a replication of this throughout the Arab world. We've seen it this year. In Egypt, of course, you have Tahrir Square, and the ambition of the Mubarak regime was to, if you recall, retake Tahrir Square early on, and when it was unable to do that, it tried to create chaos in Tahrir Square, to try to create a security situation that was unbearable, the idea being to frighten people so that they would leave Tahrir Square, if you remember the famous incident with the camels, but also the fighting between the pro-Mubarak supporters and those from Tahrir Square. In other words, if you can't capture a space, at least you try to make it untenable for the other side. In Bahrain, perhaps a very interesting situation, the protesters took over Pearl Roundabout, if you remember. The regime relatively quickly entered and did something to this day that I find quite remarkable. It's they destroyed the monument at the center of this roundabout. In other words, they completely, it was sort of, they obliterated the symbolism of the place. And I mean, how symbolic is a roundabout? It's not the best place to defend, but it is a place where tents were put up. It is a place that was given, that has gained the symbolism from that event. In Yemen, of course, we had rival squares taking place, the pro-Ali Abdullah Saleh supporters and those opposed. And in Libya, it was not so much a place or a plaza or a locale as much as a city that was taken over by the rebels, Benghazi. And that, of course, offered a number of new opportunities in the sense that when you have a city, obviously you have a territory in which you can create a government or a rival government to the government you're trying to overthrow. In Syria, we've had the Assad regime. It's a very interesting case in Syria because the regime has had to face these proliferating revolts from the south in Daraa to the area of Homs, Hama. Now, the regime did try to contain and has succeeded largely in containing in places like central Damascus and in Aleppo, but it has lost ground substantially in places like Hama, in, of course, Homs, of large parts of the city, a different strategy in the Kurdish areas. But once again, what we're talking about is a fight over space, because space contains, to a certain extent, the ability to project political power, independence. It's a place from which the regime, it's very powerful to see a place where you can have tens and hundreds of thousands of people and the regime is unable to remove them. It really underlines or affirms the weakness of a regime. And the way to protect your space, as I said, in Lebanon 2005, in many of these Arab societies, by building a tent city and, in effect, settling in a place and not leaving it at any point. And who tends to live in these tent cities, by and large? It's not people of my age or older, or it tends to be young people who tend to be idealistic, so that those who are in these spaces tend to be, I won't use the word radical, but more convinced of their positions than the older their older peers. And often it's the tent cities where the frustration is highest, as we saw last week in Tahrir Square. It's really in the tent cities where the people are the most mobilized, and it's there also where the fall tends to be most bitter when reality kicks in. Second thing I would like to look at, with your permission, is the instruments of repression. In 2005, as I said earlier, Lebanon was essentially embodying a rebellion against the security forces and a rejection of the security chiefs. For the first time that I can remember in the Middle East, or in the Arab world at least, senior Lebanese security chiefs, or judicial officials, one was the justice minister, were forced to resign in 2005, or were fired by the government, were simply removed. Now we should, I think, reflect on this a little bit for those of you who know the Middle East. It's not often that a security chief is, in fact, if someone can think of another example, I would be happy to hear it. It's not often where a security chief leaves his office where he's not dismissed by a monarch or a dictator. It's not, the street does not remove security officials in the Middle East, except if there is war. I mean, we can talk about Libya in a bit of a different context. One of those, if I could just make a brief aside, one of those who left was a gentleman by the name of Jamil al-Sayyid, who was the head of the Sûreté Générale. And in a way, maybe it was, I tell this story only as a reminder of the arm of the security apparatus. When Jamil al-Sayyid was forced to leave, or I think he resigned, I'm not sure if he was fired or dismissed, I think he resigned. at the end of April 2005. I called my friend, the journalist Samir Asir, to congratulate him, because Samir had attacked Jamil al-Sayed and had been quite, I would say, persecuted by Jamil al-Sayed. He had been followed and harassed, and Jamil al-Sayed had never forgiven Samir Asir. I called him up and I said, I just wanted to congratulate you on this day. And he was very happy. He said, yes, it really is a good day. Well, just over a month later, he was assassinated in Beirut. And I'm convinced that his past had something to do with that, his past enmities. And so, yes, you can get rid of the security chief, but the apparatus does tend to stay longer. And it does, it can come back and haunt you. In Lebanon, in 2005, those protesting against Syria and against the Lebanese government, I think quite cleverly, here tactics kick in, played on the differences between the different types of security agencies. I still remember on the first Monday after Hariri's assassination, I was marching with my fellow protesters, and we were going down to the old city, and we were followed by units of riot police behind us. And as we were walking down the road towards another square, not Martyrs Square, but nearby, there were two rows of soldiers on either side. And people began, instead of telling the army to go to hell, they said, no army in Lebanon but the Lebanese army. And I thought this was quite a clever, people had done this before. You neutralize the security forces. You play on the nationalism in the Lebanese army. And indeed, subsequently, the Lebanese army avoided a confrontation with those protesters throughout the post-February 14th period. The Lebanese army played a very subtle game where it would implement the decisions of the government and at the same time avoid implementing it. So that, for example, on February 28th, I remember this is a very amusing recollection, the army said people are not allowed to enter Martyrs Square to protest. Of course, there were tens of thousands of people there. The army had made a barrier in front of us. And as we were about to move forward, someone said, wait, hold on. I need a group of 10 or 15. Come with me. So we went with him. And we entered into this military barrier, these soldiers. And one of the soldiers muttered to a woman next to me, push, push. And she couldn't understand. He said, push, so I can let you through. And so she pushed, and she got through. And it was very interesting because the army was playing it both ways, you see. It was implementing its orders, but it wasn't firing on the crowd. And we see this again in Egypt earlier this year at Tahrir Square. The Egyptian army at the time also tried to play subtly this game, and the protesters tried to play this subtle game with the army. Let's use the army against the regime. The army itself almost propping itself up as a legitimate force on whom the protesters could rely, even as it was out to protect its own interests. So, I think, just before I go on to the third thing, I think there is a fundamentally important moment when when protesters come to the conclusion that their security chiefs are accountable. I think that the value of what we're seeing in the Arab world today, the merits of what we are seeing today, will be to a large extent defined by the security orders that are imposed in the aftermath of these revolts. In other words, are these new security orders, are the instruments of repression under civilian control? Are they accountable? Do they accept the pluralism in many of these societies? Yes or no? And this, I think, is a fundamental question that we have to ask of all the Arab. In Egypt, what did we have? We had perhaps regime decapitation. I think it was almost inevitable that we would reach the stage that we reached last week, where the public said, well, wait a minute, what, are you making fun of us? we got rid of Mubarak, but it's not Mubarak. We wanted to change the system, at least some of the protesters. But then things became complicated when elections kicked in. This is an essential moment, I think, in an Arab society. In Libya, it's a contrary thing. What is defining the post-war security system or the instruments of repression? It's really the balance of power at the end of the war. The war stopped, suddenly rather, once Gaddafi was found and killed. Today, you have a number of militias that reflect tribal, regional, other loyalties. They're trying to form an army, but I think that's going to have mixed success. In effect, the balance of power, the military balance of power, is being defined by the status quo at the end of the war. Will this lead to a more accountable security force in Libya? I hope so, but I don't think it will. The same thing in Syria. So this, I think, is a fundamentally important moment in 2005 when the Lebanese were able to say our security chiefs in some way were responsible for Hariri's assassination. They represent an illegitimate political order that we're trying to get rid of with the Syrian departure. And I think that's also worthy of mention. The third thing I would like to discuss is outside intervention. Two reasons I think Lebanon didn't get its due from 2005 were because of the last two dimensions I'll discuss. One is foreign intervention, the second is the aftermath of what happened in 2005. In 2005, I think the problem Lebanon had is that in opposing Syria, it really went against the general trend in the region that held. Well, let me reverse. Who supported what went on in Lebanon in 2005 internationally? Well, Jacques Chirac, France, and George W. Bush, although Bush did it a bit late. I think Bush caught on late to what was happening in Lebanon, but when he caught on, he stuck with it. So that I think the perception in the Arab world is that, we're not going to be with Bush against two bulwarks of resistance, namely Hezbollah and Syria. This affected a lot, I think, the perception in the Arab world of what happened in Lebanon. This was perceived as, to this day, you will have people tell you this was a bourgeois revolt. In fact, it was much more than that. But who was on TV? It was westernized Lebanese who tended to dress nicely, who tended to speak different languages. The middle class, just to give you the dynamics of that month. Remember, Hariri was killed on a Monday, so that every Monday they would commemorate his assassination. Now, who works on Mondays? Who can take a day off on Monday, let me say? Not many people, okay? If you're a professional, maybe you can. But if you're an employee, if you're relatively modest, of modest means, you can't go to your boss and say, I'm taking today off. He'll tell you no. So that those who kept alive the protest were those who could go in the week, during the week time, who tended to be from the middle class, educated, who tended to live around Martyrs Square. And because of that, it became a perception that this was somehow a middle class, as someone, I can't remember who, very uncharitably described the so-called Cedar Revolution, described it as a Prada Revolution, which I found, if we can do a Prada Revolution, it's to our honor. But there were also many people behind that who maybe were not there because they couldn't afford to be there, but who at distinct points during that month came down to Martyrs Square. I mean, of course, March 14th, 2005. I think, perhaps were there 1 million people there? I don't know. Maybe there were 800,000. Maybe there were 7. There were an awful lot of people, and from all social categories. But the point I'm making is that there was a perception that, these middle-class Lebanese who have the backing of George W. Bush and Jacques Chirac are not really people who were going to side with, who were really comfortable with, against Hezbollah and Syria. And even, I would say, in the Western left, there was, I remember very well, on the 8th of March, Hezbollah organized a massive demonstration. And suddenly, you could just almost hear the rumble of content amongst many in the international left. That, now finally we're seeing the authentic Lebanese. It's not these it's not these Prada people who represent Lebanon. It's Hezbollah, and Hezbollah is with Syria, and so Lebanon is divided on the issue of Syria. It was, certainly it was, but I still think there was a substantial number of people who were unhappy with the Syrian presence. And the Syrians did indeed leave. Had they had the real support of half the population, as many said, they would not have left. I think there is another element that we're seeing in the Arab world today that reflects this. Of course, in the Arab world today, the whole issue of foreign intervention, as you know, has taken on a great deal of importance in light of Libya, in light today of Syria, in light of even of Egypt. And in a way, it's redefined the role of foreign intervention, I think, in the Arab world. In the past, there was a perception that any kind of Western intervention in the Arab world was, by definition, illegitimate. In Libya, we saw that this was not the case. In Syria, you've had protesters demanding for outside intervention. There have been divisions or differences within the Syrian opposition on this question, but the issue of foreign intervention is not illegitimate in the way that it seemed to be in 2005. You see, or it seemed to be in 2003 in Iraq. In the Arab world, there is a much greater acceptance of the notion that foreign intervention against the dictatorship is somehow acceptable, or more acceptable than it used to be. Now, essential to this, if I could just throw this in, is the question of narrative. I think we should not underestimate the heroic narrative aspect of these revolutions. When people see others revolting, the Egyptians looked at Tunisia, the Libyans looked at Egypt, the Syrians looked at Libya, the Syrians looked at Egypt. They suddenly see this sort of meta-narrative taking form in their minds of successful revolution, successful revolt. And they then want to be part of that. And I think this was essential to the spreading of what took place in the Middle East. And in a way, that meta-narrative does leave room in itself for a certain amount of acceptable foreign intervention, okay? In a way, if the narrative is seen as we're running the game, if we're revolting, then it becomes almost fréquentable, as they say. It becomes almost acceptable to absorb the notion that those helping you from outside are really feeding into your narrative. And we remember this very well. I mean, I don't want to sound too philosophical here, but the point is there is a legitimacy that you didn't have perhaps in 2003 in Iraq or in 2005 in Lebanon. It's important, I think, to see this. And the Lebanese in 2005, though very intelligently, understood the importance of the narrative. I think so. I'm not going to go on at length, but 2005, there was a friend of mine who heads a big ad agency, and with his partners, they had really participated in the revolt of 2005 in Lebanon, the so-called Independence Intifada, and they helped it in many ways, symbolically, in terms of its symbolism, in terms of the colors that were held up, the scarves that were worn, the slogans that came out. In a way, they created a narrative. And they understood that this narrative was important precisely because there was an outside audience, predominantly a Western audience, looking at it. And what do Western audiences look for? They look for narratives in what's going on. They looked for one in Georgia. They looked for one in the Ukraine. For a Western audience to understand Lebanon, they're never going to understand the complexity of Lebanon. But they do understand that, well, if you've got, this is a David and Goliath fight, we are with David. I'm not sure many would appreciate that comparison, but anyway, the point of the matter is that the Lebanese protesters played off played off what they understood the West, how the West wanted them to be. They understood the West wanted to see a heroic narrative here, and they did it in terms of their protests, in terms of the symbolism of their protests. And so that's one aspect of foreign intervention that I think is interesting to this day. We saw this in Egypt, the symbolism at Tahrir Square, the symbolism in Benghazi, perhaps less successful in Yemen, but an effort to appeal to outside, to the Western media in particular, but to the outside world in general, to say we are part of this story of liberation, no matter how true or false that is. We deserve to be given, we deserve to be recognized for this. And may I just add, before I go to the aftermath, one thing in which Lebanon was quite important, and we may see this in other contexts, is that Hariri, when he was assassinated, the United Nations put together an international investigation of his crime, and that investigation eventually led to a tribunal, which is functioning. I've been critical of it, but I would like to see it succeed, which is functioning, in fact, under a Canadian. The prosecutor is a Canadian. And so what we see here also, this is the first time that the UN investigated a political assassination, first time ever. We see the intervention of the UN, the intervention of international justice to a certain extent. And this is something also that we may see replicated, problematically perhaps, in some of these Arab societies. As you know, some of you may know, the ICC has already indicted Gaddafi and Saif al-Islam. There is the possibility, it's not easy, but there is the possibility of indictments in Syria eventually for crimes against humanity. I mean, the notion of outside intervention, whether direct intervention or through the instruments of the international community and the judicial instruments of the international community, is something today much more acceptable than it was 5-6 years ago. Finally, I would like to discuss the aftermath, because this has been under I think, many people. One of the reasons Lebanon, I think, also suffers today as a sort of a initial spark for the Arab uprising is the aftermath. In Lebanon 2005, we had 2005, we had February, March 2005, but that was then followed by parliamentary elections in which all these people who had been united at Martyrs Square suddenly became political rivals. As is usual in Lebanon, it broke down into political acrimony. In 2006, there was the war, the Hezbollah-Israel war in South Lebanon. South Lebanon, most of Lebanon, but focused in South Lebanon. So there was a perception by 2006, and that was, by the way, followed by more domestic conflict, leading almost to the verge of, I won't say civil war, but leading to it essentially almost to armed conflict that was averted. So that, this tended to shape the perceptions of 2005. If you have a disappointing aftermath, then you tend to look at the revolt itself, the rebellion itself, the intifada itself, as being perhaps a failure. And certainly in the case of Lebanon, this was the perception. I think it's a mistake to go to in a way to interpret things quite with with such how should I say, absolutism, because in a way, if you judge these revolts by their aftermath, then in a way it's almost an indirect way of saying, well, if the outcome doesn't satisfy what we see as a satisfactory outcome, then it delegitimizes the initial decision to rebel. Well, I don't think anyone today can challenge the legitimacy, for example, of the Syrian people to want to overthrow the Assad regime, or of the Libyan people to want to overthrow the Gaddafi regime, or the Egyptians to get rid of Hosni Mubarak. In other words, it's difficult, I think, to play this game of 20/20 hindsight. nor is it particularly realistic. Let me add to that. Excuse me. The obviously one thing that is interpreting the outcomes today in many Arab countries, we saw this in Tunisia, we're seeing this in Egypt today. One salient, one essential question is, will the Islamists come out on top? Now, the perception, rightly or wrongly, we can discuss this in another context, is that if the Islamists emerge, by and large, religious groups are undemocratic. Therefore, they will create orders that are undemocratic, where women will be discriminated against, where people will not be able. These are illiberal orders that are going to emerge from this. This is an essential problem today at the center of the interpretation of the Arab revolts. Now, it's a shame, I think, today that we should be, if we adopt this attitude, that essentially we're falling into the paradigm that Arab dictators themselves have created for us for so long. Because it really was the Arab dictators who said, look, it's either us or them, either us or the Islamists. There is perhaps at some point, you have to break out of that. Take what happened in Tunisia. You had an election in Tunisia in which 35, maybe 40% went to Al-Nahda. Fine, that was, personally, I'm not religious, so I don't like to see religious groups coming out on top. But the point is, you still have 60% of Tunisian society that did not vote Al-Nahda. In Egypt, we'll see what the outcome is when these elections finally end. I've never seen longer elections. I think that the counterweights in many of these societies, in Syria as well, that the counterweights to the religious parties are often substantial. We shouldn't assume automatically that if the Islamists do well, therefore the initial revolt, the initial decision to rebel was necessarily wrong. And yet, I think there is a lot of interpretation today that is using precisely this approach. Now, the second aspect of it, and then I'll be closing, the second thing to look at, if I could re-stress this, is the issue of the instruments of repression. As I said earlier, and I think it's worth repeating, the success or failure of these Arab revolts is to a large extent going to rely on the nature of the instruments of repression in the aftermath. Do these orders create accountable? You're not going to have maybe a Canadian system in Libya or in Egypt, but do you have a certain amount of accountability in the new order that is installed, or on the contrary, have you simply changed those giving the orders? In other words, the Gaddafi is gone, but are you going to have a new system in place where the intelligence or the security services impose another kind of authoritarianism? This is, I think, a fundamental question that we will have to investigate in the future. And it's here, I think, if the West needs to define a role for itself. I mention the West only because I happen to be speaking to a Western audience. It's the reality. It's here. It's here where I think the most important pressures can be brought. Do you have accountable or relatively accountable security orders? It's a mixed bag. We've had a really mixed bag in the Arab world today. Now, just to conclude, I've tried in this brief talk sort of to explain, to outline what strikes me as recurring patterns of democratic revolts in the Arab world. What happened in Lebanon in 2005 was not unique, nor should it have been unique. What happened in 2011, I don't believe is unique. Will we see a recurrence of this in the future? Perhaps. We've certainly seen it in Egypt. We had January, we had recently. Again, the results are mitigated, but we did see a second impulse. Sorry, I've lost my... here we go. Just to close on the issue of authenticity. What we saw in these as I said, we've seen recurring patterns in Arab societies in search of some kind of emancipation. That's a very large word, so let's use it. But I think Lebanon 2005 was as authentic as Iraq 2005, was as authentic as Tahrir 2011, as authentic as Syria today. The notion of authenticity is often bestowed from the outside, but in and of itself, I think that I'm sorry to say that in Lebanon's case, the tag of inauthenticity came from the Arab world, from many in the Arab world, perhaps more from those in the Arab world than in the West. And perhaps I will conclude by saying, David, thank you for allowing me to mention Lebanon, to say that, we always tend as Lebanese to think we're unique in the world. We're not. But in this particular case, I think 2005 offered a very interesting message that's worth studying in the same way that what we see today is worth studying for the future. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Now, we're going to take 2 or 3 minutes. Are you okay, Michael? You'd like to proceed? Okay. There are 2 sets of microphones, or at least there are 2 microphones here. Those wishing to make comments briefly or ask questions equally briefly, please go to the microphones. I don't know if Michael prefers to take them one at a time or perhaps a couple at a go. Well, we sometimes take 2 or 3 at a go, allowing you to weave your own comments from strands in the comments and remarks. Please, sir.
Thank you.
And could you identify yourself?
I don't know if you can hear me. Can you?
Yeah.
Thank you very much. My name is Farouk Aman. I'm actually from the Middle East, Yemen. Basically, I wanted to present the issue of foreign intervention. You touched on that. There's a general doubt, of course, in the Middle East that foreign intervention is not necessary for the sake of freedom and democracy. Can you elaborate on that, please?
Is not necessary.
Is not necessary.
And, ma'am, would you...
Thank you very much for your speech. My name is Pega. I just want to know, in terms of the situation in the Arab world, could you comment on how and if it would be pertinent to Iran, seeing how it is a neighboring country to the Arab world? Thank you.
Thank you. Well, why don't you take those 2 while others think of what they'd like to say?
The first question, if I understood, the perception in the Arab world is that foreign intervention is not necessary to freedom and democracy. Is that correct? Okay. No, I don't. I think that's correct by and large. Freedom and democracy is one thing, but finding a balance between a society in a state of revolt and a regime that has all the instruments of repression on its side is a different thing. In other words, today, if you revolt, the desire for freedom and democracy, or freedom without them, I don't know, but freedom and democracy is inherent to you, to your revolt. You're not asking someone, a Western power or government, to supply that. That's from you. But it's, I think, a different case if you feel that, all right, I've given legitimacy to this, the revolt, by going into the streets, by protesting, by taking casualties in many cases. But there's nothing wrong if, to balance out my very unbalanced relationship with a regime that has the tanks and the guns I ask for assistance from abroad. You see what I'm trying to say? I think there is a nuance here. Unfortunately, in Lebanon in 2005, this is precisely the calculation. All the instruments in Lebanon of repression were on the side of Syria and its allies, all of them. There was one instrument only against. It was simply the ability to mobilize in the streets. What happened in Benghazi this year? Well, there was a revolt, and then Gaddafi and his forces managed almost to they entered Benghazi. They were on the verge of crushing the rebellion. The UN decided to intervene. Air power entered. I don't think that you could have gone to any of the Libyans and said, this is illegitimate. They would have said, no, we did need foreign assistance here to help us. But at the same time, they would go out and say also, the aspiration for freedom and democracy didn't come from Washington or Paris or London. I mean, we're the ones who went into the streets initially. And this, in a sense, what I was trying to say in my talk, this in a way lent some legitimacy to the foreign intervention. You see what it's a slight difference. Whereas, for example, I'm sorry to say, perhaps this will get me banned from Ottawa forever, but I did support the removal of Saddam Hussein in 2003. But I can also understand that there was a perception in the Arab world that this was a decision taken by an American administration in which there were not Iraqis involved, or at least the Iraqis that were involved were not seen at the time as the legitimate Iraqis. I can understand that what's taking place today in the region is different in terms of perception. Because the initial motive and impetus, the desire for democracy and freedom, as you said, is coming from within. But that doesn't mean that you don't need help. Any kind of successful, to my mind, any kind of successful rebellion against a dictatorship is going to involve a combination of domestic refusal, rejection of the regime, and outside help. Now, the second question on Iran, I'm sorry to say, when I talk about Iran, I feel very modest because I don't know enough about Iran to answer that question in a convincing way. Will it affect Iran? I'm almost tempted to ask what you think. I assume it will. But honestly, I don't want to go into a territory where my ignorance will be. That includes quite a lot of territory. But
please, sir, and then we'll come to you.
Hello, my name's John, and my question has to do with the point you brought up about the manipulation of Western media. I was very interested in that point in particular. I think back to some of the revolts that happened, and I think of the media reports that occurred that we saw here, and people seem to be more upset about the fact that Twitter was banned and people were being killed in the street. And so my question to you is, how profound is that thinking, I guess, among all the rebel groups that in the countries where we saw Arab revolts, and how much do they understand that is, I guess, a crucial piece in having Western media on their side, and to what extent do they, I guess, mobilize their forces to make that point?
So I'm just wondering if you can comment on the role of diasporas, particularly because the Lebanese diaspora is probably one of the most widespread diasporas that there is. The role of diasporas both in supporting these sort of revolts and also in transferring information about these revolts to the wider community, particularly the Western world. For example, here in Ottawa, we've had protests regularly for almost all of these revolts at some point, organized by members of those communities who are living in diaspora. So definitely, the role of diaspora in terms of supporting these movements and spreading information about them internationally, and also even around this issue of foreign intervention. The role of diaspora is also in requesting foreign intervention from their governments where they're living now. Thank you.
Thank you. I think both of your questions, in a way, feed into each other. The question, the first was the manipulation of the Western media and how. Sorry, where are you? Could you just reformulate the question? Sorry, I have a terrible memory to. I want to answer specifically.
How profound, I guess, was the thought or the strategy of manipulating Western media?
Right, today in the right.
The rebel groups.
Right, exactly. Yeah, as you were asking the question, I was thinking of all these signs written in very poor English, but going up from Benghazi to Homs to, but who were they appealing to? They were obviously. Yes. The fact is that, but not only, they were also appealing to an Arab audience. Let's not at all underestimate the role of a station, an institution like Al Jazeera today in these revolts, which is in many respects central, has been, I think, central to what has gone on. It's how the Arab satellite stations have played this, especially Al Jazeera. If I could give you an example, in Syria, it took time for Al Jazeera to take sides. It took time. And I remember I wrote a column, an article saying, why are you delaying? You supported it in Libya, you supported it in Egypt. Why is Al Jazeera not, and Al Arabiya not supporting what's going on in Syria? There was a debate at the time in Al Jazeera. It seems we saw who came out on top. But yes, an essential feature that in all these revolts has been an appeal to media in general, Arab media, Al Jazeera above all, but Arab media, and international media, depending on the political objective that you want to attain at a specific time. If you want international assistance, for example, then you put up a sign saying, Friday of international assistance, a sign saying Friday of international assistance or international intervention. I think that's one of the Fridays they had in Syria. Because if you're facing overpowering force, the only real ability, the only real weapon you have is media, is the shock value of seeing people killed, in a way. And this comes back to my question, the point I was raising about narratives. There is this people function according to narratives. If I'm sitting at home in Damascus, and, I have Bashar al-Assad talking to Vanity Fair and saying, we won't have the Arab Spring here because the people are on my side and we believe in resistance. And I'm with resistance. The Syrians want to resist. They will not revolt against me. And then, lo and behold, a few weeks later, they revolt against him. If I'm sitting at home in Syria when Bashar al-Assad does that speech, and suddenly I see what's going on in Egypt and in Tunisia and in Libya and so on and so forth, I become part of this bigger story. And that can be tremendously powerful. That's what takes people down to the streets day after day. And this is, by the way, something that in Lebanon 2005, I know there's been a tendency to, even amongst Lebanese, to sort of look back on that and sort of dismiss it. But there was tremendous power at the time. For those who went down and protested, there is tremendous power in crowds of hundreds of thousands of people, singing the same songs or using the same slogans and basically insulting the same people. This is really very, very satisfying. And you become part of this narrative yourself, and that's what allows you to come down again and again. I'm convinced that the Syrians today, when they saw Gaddafi fall, they saw Bashar, and I'm not convinced that's the case, Now, your question on diasporas, which in a way feeds in from this other question, absolutely. I think that the issue is media. What is important in what interests. The West is not interested, by and large, or was not that interested in the Arab world in January of this year. But a good way to get it interested is by, again, picking up a narrative and using this narrative to persuade news outlets or media outlets that this is an interesting story. And this is a story that's worth picking up on. Now, it's hit or miss. The Syrian story took months to really get the coverage it deserved in many Western media outlets, for example, because maybe Syria is perceived as less important in many countries to the United States than Egypt is, for example. But once media picks up a story, and this is where the diaspora is essential, it becomes very difficult to escape it. I can give you as an example. I don't think anyone really doubts that Barack Obama didn't want to get involved in Libya. He didn't want to get involved. But when Gaddafi's forces were on the verge of taking Benghazi, and Gaddafi had promised to massacre everyone, I mean, like rats. Suddenly, I think, he must have thought back, Obama, to Bill Clinton during the fall of Srebrenica. This is a story you don't want to have on your record. You're not worried that much about Benghazi or Srebrenica. You're worried about yourself. As an administration, can you absorb the backlash of allowing a massacre to occur? And this is where diasporas, I think, kick in. Perhaps this is where they're interesting role, is they can play this essential link between the interests of an administration or a government, its interests, and the interests of the people back home, and bring them together. And we've seen this, I think, time and again this year, and we did see it in Lebanon in 2005.
Hello, my name is Yaron. Question about the Special Tribunal for Lebanon.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned you'd like to see it succeed. My question to you is, what is your definition of success, and why would that be beneficial for the future of Lebanon?
Mm-hmm.
My name is Sonia Robe, and my question is about the aftermath and the accountability. There is no mention of the judiciary process and the aftermath and the accountability. And knowing that you are a defender of the Special Tribunal for Lebanon, I'm surprised that you didn't mention that, especially also that the aftermath in Iraq and Libya, from the point of view of the judiciary process, went really wrong. So my question is about the judiciary process, and I have a more specific question inside. What do you think now that Saif al-Islam is wanted by the International Criminal Court, and the Libyan government does not seem ready to give Saif al-Islam to the International Criminal Court, while at the same time there was a consensus in Lebanon to give up some of its judicial sovereignty to the UN tribunal. So I see like an asymmetry here, because Saif al-Islam, it is in the hands of a non-elected government, but legitimized by the foreign intervention, while the people who are wanted for the murder of Hariri in Lebanon are actually in the hand of an international court, and Lebanon, the government of Lebanon is a legitimate government. So my question is about the judiciary.
Okay. Thank you for that question, which, again, these two questions feed off each other. If I could answer these, because it's a bit complex. Now, in terms of the STL, my own views of the STL are, look, the STL as an institution and the investigation of Hariri's crime, I think, was important at a specific moment in 2005 to show that, there would be no more impunity. But it was derailed. It was derailed, and I will say this quite bluntly, I think, by the second investigator, Bramertz, a Belgian. I don't think he investigated. All the evidence that I've had from people even within his team in the Lebanese hierarchy, for reasons that I don't know, but we can discuss at length, and I won't do that here, I don't think he investigated, or he didn't do what he needed to do to take this investigation to trial as quickly as he should have. So I think that the impact has been lost. Today we have 4 people who are indicted by the STL. You had said they're in prison. They're not. These are 4 members of Hezbollah, as you know. They've been indicted. I think that it's after 6 years of investigation to indict 4 individuals at the operational level is I'm sorry, it's not my definition of success. There may be more people indicted, perhaps. I'm not holding my breath. I hope I'm wrong. I may be wrong. So the impact, the positive impact on impunity, on ending impunity, to my mind, is finished. And if I may add, the first investigator, Detlev Melis, is of the same view. You don't have to listen to me, but I think he also felt that the investigation was derailed for various reasons we don't need to get into. So, now, your question is very interesting because you were raising, in a way, this issue of sovereignty and justice. I thought I did mention justice. Perhaps I didn't do it as much as you wanted, but I did mention the investigation and the ICC indictment of Saif al-Islam. But I thank you for the question because this is an essential element in what we're seeing today in many of these countries. Like you, I think I detect your disappointment at the fact that the Libyan government does not want to hand over Saif al-Islam. My disappointment with the killing of Gaddafi is precisely the same. I mean, in the end, if you want to dismantle the instrument of repression, a court is often a very useful context, or provides a very useful context to do so, to deconstruct the system as it existed. And I also tend to agree that it's better the ICC do so, or an international body, than a domestic court where you have always the risk of politicization, of cover-up, because these people have a lot of information. You know, these individuals have a lot of information, and a lot of people may not want that information to come out. So, you know, I share your point. Now, you were asking, I'm sorry, I didn't quite get your point on the, you said the asymmetrical relationship. Yeah, it's true.
If I may say,
please.
I am seeing here some asymmetry. What I find as a bias, because there was foreign intervention in Iraq and Libya, the foreign intervention, the countries that are behind this foreign intervention were ready to close their eyes on the judicial process, while in Lebanon there was a legitimate government who agreed on giving up judicial sovereignty to the UN. So I'm seeing some asymmetry here, because in Lebanon there wasn't foreign intervention. So was the judicial process a kind of foreign intervention?
Well, it was. But, I mean, I think Lebanon, we shouldn't go over. Lebanon was a very rare instance where the demands of the government at the time, if I recall, it was the Mi'ati government, the first Mi'ati government that existed. It was a very peculiar moment in Lebanese history in which Lebanon did accept to cede its sovereignty on this issue. You're not going to see this often. In fact, you're not going to see this that much. You may not see this again. You know, countries don't cede sovereignty easily. I'm not sure you're quite right that a country like the U.S. is not going to push Libya to give up Saif al-Islam to the ICC. It doesn't recognize. It hasn't signed on to the convention. But the point, you know, but. Again, I don't think we should just put this at the door of foreign intervention. There are even, you know, post-revolutionary regimes often also like to have a lot to hide. So, you know, I'm not sure I answered your question. But
why don't we take the three remaining questions, the people who have been standing, and then we'll wrap up, Michael, if you agree. So, sir, we can start with you, but you've also been waiting over here.
My name is Joseph Debane. I would like to seize this wonderful opportunity from somebody coming from Lebanon to give us his candid assessment of the democracy in Lebanon. We know there is a free press, probably one of the freest in the world. And we are bombarded almost every week with statements about the only democracy in the world in Israel and so forth. And I think perhaps we should have a better idea of how representative the government in Lebanon is.
Thank you. I'm on your mailing list, by the way, for some reason.
Yes.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Jonathan Williams. I could ask you 1,000 questions, and probably you would. Sorry, I've got a cold. Might not answer all of them because there's so many things that I imagine are really, really hard to know at this point. My question's a couple things more specifically about Egypt. I'm amazed at the revolution and how professionally it seems to be done. in Egypt. I noticed, I work in a political office, and we get so many emails from people that have opinions that you couldn't say, that if you put them out in the public, they would, create a firestorm. And yet, in the Egyptian revolution, it seems like people were extremely on message for, 1 million people in the street. And so I'm curious now, watching what seems to have happened in terms of there's a revolutionary movement, and then the Muslim Brotherhood has moved away from that and perhaps in agreement with the military, essentially military regime. So I'm curious if in some of these cases we'll find, add another nuance to this.
Perhaps not too many nuances.
Yeah. Reading the press today, there was a right-wing commentator saying, we got to worry about these revolutions because they might put Islamists in power, which is their worry in Egypt. So is there a possibility that the West is going to find that we actually can accept very Islamist governments, which we do? And is this actually a real revolution that's happening in Egypt, or is it the kind of manipulation of just allowing the revolution to do what they wanted to do anyway and keep the military in power?
Mm-hmm. Great. Thank you. And sir, you're the last one.
My name is Salah Mary. My question is on the aftermath. Mm-hmm. Well, we all know maybe that all those dictators that's been toppled or they are going in that way were created maybe and fed by the West. And now the people are asking the West for help. Now, what the West will do if, after the toppling of the dictator, what we're going to see? Are we going to see an Arab summer, or we're going to go back to the Dark Age?
Mm-hmm. Okay. Sorry. First question, Mr. Debani. A candid assessment of democracy in Lebanon. Well, some would dispute that we could put Lebanon and democracy together. I don't believe that protest would be accurate. One of the reasons I wrote this book is to argue that in Lebanon you have a system that is paradoxically liberal. It's not. Why paradoxically liberal? Because Lebanon is based on illiberal institutions, but in a way they tend to cancel each other out or to impose an equilibrium on each other. What ensues is it creates spaces in which people can act or can behave in, pretty much be what they want to be within certain parameters. I don't want to overstate that fact. Lebanese democracy, or what is called Lebanese democracy, is very much, as you know, based on an equilibrium between different political forces. They can be sectarian political forces, but I think we should not overstate the sectarianism. There are other political forces. Those of you who want to know a bit more, I recommend highly that you read a very short essay by Albert Horani on the ideologies of the mountain of the city. He basically argues that Lebanon, yes, sectarianism is essential to the system, but there are other loyalties, other solidarities that in a way intervene to shape the nature of the country. And I think in a way Lebanon is a country that is built through counterpoint. It tends to, as I said, freedom, which can be a very relative concept there, but it tends, spaces are created for this. It's created for this because of the contradictions within the society. Now, this is terribly abstract. I'm sorry. It's a question I'm afraid that I can't answer in more detail because it's such a vast subject. But I would just say Lebanon is a democracy in counterpoint. It's really a paradoxical form of liberalism. And my assessment of it today is that while on the one hand it has created these spaces of freedom, in 2005, what's important about 2005 is that for a brief moment, the different political forces came together in alignment. They were in alignment for a brief moment, minus a majority of Shia, we should mention that. But they came together to create a majority view that Syria had to leave, that Hariri had to be, that there had to be accountability in the Hariri murder. It was a brief moment. It broke down afterwards. So, but it also has created, Lebanon is a dysfunctional system. Whatever we say, Lebanon today is a dysfunctional system. We urgently need a new social contract because we cannot continue to function through counterpoint. Freedom is fine. I support it. We must defend it as at the heart of our system. But at the same time, if you have a system that doesn't function, you do need to renegotiate your social contract. I think the problem is today we're not in any condition to renegotiate it, unfortunately. On Egypt, is there a possibility that the West will accept Islamic governments? And was there a real government in Egypt? Well, I think certainly the West has shifted in the last 11 months on Islamic groups. They've shifted now. Maybe in some maybe they prefer Al-Nahda in Tunisia to the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. But you've noticed, it's been palpable that in the West, the attitude in terms of perceptions, in terms of media, in terms of mood, even at the official level, that, well, if democracy means that you're going to have Islamist groups playing a role in governance, then that's democracy. You see what I'm saying? You haven't had this notion that, no, this is the worst possible outcome. There have been genuine fears, but I still very much remember the article, I think it was in the New York Times, or on what's the name of the head of the Tripoli Military Committee, who was an Al-Qaeda member, Barhaj, who had been taken by the Americans, and what did he say to the media? He said, "Well, no, I've changed. Really, I like America. I'm with America." Now, maybe he is, but somehow I have my doubts. I think that you will see more openness to that option, but at the same time it will be accompanied by great fear. And I think the Egyptian government, to answer the second part of your question, the Egyptian army is going to play it this way. I think they will say, or they will see themselves almost as an Ataturk institution, Ataturk-like institution, in the sense that we will present ourselves as the defenders of the state, the secular state, against the Islamists. Now, they've done it very clumsily up to now, but I have a sense that if the Muslim Brotherhood does well, the army will try to use this to position itself as the counterpoint, as the counterweight. Sorry, I'm getting lost in my counterpoints here. As the counterweight to and then we have to see what happens. Obviously, Egypt, in terms of American interests, let's say, is very different than Tunisia or Libya. I mean, all are quite important at this point, but I think there are different stakes. Now, the gentleman who I was waiting for this question, that the dictators were created by the West. I'm sorry, I disagree with this. The West certainly sustained a lot of dictators, but our societies, and here my Arab side comes out to protest. Our societies sustained a lot of these regimes for a long time. I mean, that today we've revolted or that societies are revolting is great. But in a way, it's a revolt against our own inaction for decades. I really don't want to blame the victims. I don't want to blame the Syrians for having accepted 40 years of this sordid rule of the Assads. I don't want to do that. But it's true, there were 40 years of Assad rule. That people decided today enough is enough is, as I said, to their credit. But I think we who come from Arab societies, whether half or a quarter or 100%, we have to also look at ourselves. What kind of institutions sustain these regimes? Is there something? And please, I'm not getting here into the issue of, if you're a Muslim, does this make you less democratic? I think that has been shattered by what we've seen this year, okay? These culturalist arguments. But at the same time, why is it that this region has been such a bastion of authoritarianism? And will Arabs want to go back? No, I don't think they want to go back. they may find themselves back under authoritarian leaders, but they don't want to go back. Definitely no.
Michael, thank you very much. A very rich presentation and beautifully structured to provoke thought. And I think, as you can see, it did provoke thought. You had the rapt attention of everybody in the room. And I'm very grateful to you, and so are my colleagues, for coming to join us here today. Many thanks.
Thanks for having me.